If God exists and is all good, all powerful, and all knowing, then why do bad things happen in our world? Christianity teaches that God is all loving and could eliminate all evil if he wanted to. So why is there disease, death, and suffering in our world? In this video, I'm going to discuss what is known as the problem of evil. I'm going to explain how atheists use evil to formulate arguments against God's existence. But then I will emphasize that good and evil aren't just problems for monotheism. This video will mainly show the arguments from evil to prepare for the next video that will show answers to these arguments. So I hope you'll stick around to explore the question of why bad things happen in a theistic world so we can eventually hear what Christianity has to say about this issue. Welcome back, everyone. In this lecture, we are talking about the problem of evil. The problem of evil, I would say, is one of the biggest issues that I hear people talk about when they talk about why they don't believe in God's existence or they don't believe in the truth of Christianity. So I think the problem of evil certainly is an important topic that needs to be discussed in any introductory apologetics series or book or course. So today we're talking about the problem of evil, and because there's so much to talk about on this issue, in this lecture I'm just going to talk about the problems that have been, and when I say the problems, I mean the logical arguments that some atheists have formulated using the concept of evil to argue that God doesn't exist. So we're just going to be looking at the arguments today and explaining how they're defended and what they're talking about. And we're doing all this because we are getting ready for the next lecture, which will mainly talk about monotheistic and Christian answers to the problem of evil and to these, and specifically also to these logical arguments that some atheists have made. So that's what we're doing in this episode. We're mainly just going to be presenting arguments from evil against belief in God's existence. Now, having said that, at the end, though, I do like to emphasize that the issue of evil is not just a problem for monotheism. It's also an issue for atheism, and maybe you already realize why that's the case if you saw the lecture on that includes the argument for God's existence called the moral argument. But anyways, we'll be talking about that in this lecture. As always, I start every lecture off with a Bible passage just to get us thinking about certain topics, but also to kind of show off what the Bible says on certain things. The passage for this lecture comes from Revelation chapter 21, verses 3 through 4. It says, "Then I heard a loud voice from the throne. Look, God's dwelling is with humanity, and he will live with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them and will be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Grief, crying, and pain will be no more, because the previous things have passed away." There's a lot of Bible passages that touch on the problem of evil, talking about why evil exists and why it's so bad and how we should avoid it. So it's kind of difficult to sit there and try to think of one main Bible passage to use on a lecture on the problem of evil. I like this passage because it comes from Revelation, talking about what is going to happen at the end of days, and basically shows the state of the universe, of God's universe, after Jesus comes back. It's more of a positive passage that just talks about how, maybe there's bad things happening right now. We know that, right? We see that every day. But the Apostle John tells us that God has promised eventually, if you read Revelation, you see everything that's going on. Eventually, God makes a new heavens and a new earth. It's not necessarily an entirely new creation. It's more like a renovated earth. But God brings heaven down and joins the heavens and the earth together, and God's special presence will be manifested. It seems like it'll be manifested everywhere in the new heavens and the new earth. And as this passage says, there will be no more death, grief, crying, or pain, and everyone's all believers from all ages will be there in their resurrected bodies, and they won't ever suffer or experience pain or death ever again. So it's really exciting if you're a Christian, something to look forward to. And I just think this is a great passage. Now, 2 lectures from now, I'm going to talk about the Bible and evil. So after looking at this philosophical problem of evil, looking at philosophical answers to it in the next lecture, the lecture after that, I'm going to have a lecture called The Bible and Evil. And I'm after having looked at these philosophical answers to the issue, I'm also going to show what I think the Bible tells us about this. So we're going to come back to a passage like this, but just for now, something to be thinking about. A lot of people worry and they say, well, if God is all-knowing, all-powerful, all good, then why doesn't he eliminate evil completely? Well, guess what? In the Bible, God has promised to do just that. It's just not, he said that he's allowing evil for now for a specific purpose. And that's what we're going to be looking at in that lecture, 2 lectures from now. But yeah, I think it's a great positive passage to focus on for this issue. I also have questions for reflection at the beginning of all these lectures, and I've got a few for you now. If you'd like to, these are just questions to be thinking about as we go through the material, as always. If you would like to interact with me, you can always answer these questions in the comment section in a video, or if you're listening to this on a podcast, you could always go to my academic website, bkylekelts.com, go to the contact form and maybe contact me that way. Ask more questions or talk about what you think the answers are. I'd love to hear from you. Well, here's our questions for reflection. 1 is, have you ever thought of why there is evil in the world if God is supposed to be all-powerful and all good? 2, how have you dealt with this thought? 3, is the existence of evil just a problem for theism? So pretty quick this lecture, just a few questions, and hopefully we'll be providing you answers to the second and third question. The first 2 questions are kind of personal, but definitely you'll be getting an answer to the third question by the time this lecture is over. So just to be clear on what we're talking about, whenever I say the problem of evil in this lecture, I'm talking about this specific definition here. I get this definition from the textbook I used to teach my Intro to Philosophy class. It's from William F. Lawhead's The Philosophical Journey. Lawhead defines the problem of evil as the difficulty of reconciling the existence of suffering and other evils in the world with the existence of God. Okay? And that's, if you ever hear someone talk about the problem of evil, if it's in the context of philosophy, this is what they're going to be talking about. It's just an issue that monotheism, when I say monotheism, I mean the belief that there's one creator God who created the universe, transcends it, sustains it in being, and usually monotheism entails this idea that God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all good. Well, obviously, for many centuries, Western philosophers have been debating this question. A lot of times throughout the history of Western philosophy, philosophers monotheists were just wrestling with it themselves. And if you studied this in contemporary philosophy, you would actually find it's a big debate going on now. But you might be surprised to hear that there weren't atheists who were Western philosophers that were specifically making these arguments as much until really contemporary times. There's been several notable examples in Western philosophy who've argued in certain ways, but these problems of evil and specifically arguing that this is evidence against God's existence, are relatively new. Usually they were just issues that monotheists were dealing with. Well, anyways, and just so you know, throughout this lecture, I'm gonna try not to be too long-winded. I specialize in the problem of evil. That's basically what I spent most of my graduate career working on. So I'm trying not to be too long-winded when I get into this. But there's an important distinction to be made between types of evil that we want to be thinking about as we go through this. This distinction will come out a lot when we talk about not only the problems, that the logical arguments that atheists have used, but a lot of times this distinction comes out, especially when we're talking about the answers to these logical arguments. So anyways, whenever philosophers these days are talking about the problem of evil, a lot of times it's not just one kind of evil that they're talking about, okay? It's evil of all sorts, but they usually fit into two main categories. There's what's called moral evil and natural evil, okay? Moral evil is evil that happens as the result of human beings making choices, right? So if you see my slides here, it says moral evil, and it's defined as bad actions and their unfortunate results for which humans or other moral agents are morally responsible. Natural evil is basically like things like hurricanes and disease and dying of natural causes and things like that, right? My slide says natural evil, and it defines it as the suffering to humans and animals resulting from natural causes such as genetic defects, diseases, earthquakes, and tornadoes. Okay, so if you ever hear me say moral evil, I'm talking about evil things in reality that are the result of human free will choices. When I talk about natural evil, I'm talking about things that hurt human beings or animals, usually events that happen in nature, okay? So just some things to be talking about. Now, what I'm going to be showing you today is a specific example of what's called the logical problem of evil. Then after I explained this one example, I was going to go on to what's called the evidential problem of evil. All of this comes out of the contemporary study of the philosophy of religion, okay? And it can be a little advanced. And at first I worried whenever I was putting this course together to teach it at Kingdom Preparatory Academy, I worried that I was just digging too deeply into the philosophical debate over this issue. You know, in a beginning apologetics class, do we really need to be looking at contemporary professional philosophers and their arguments? But you know, there's a lot of people that you'll talk to on the street will have some issue with evil, probably. I mean, it seems to be the biggest issue that I've heard people talk about if they don't believe in Christianity or if they don't believe that God exists. A lot of times it's because they're wrestling with the problem of evil. Now, they're going to have different examples and different ways of going about that, why they think that evil shows that God probably doesn't exist. But so I'm worried to myself, well, why don't I just answer these basic questions that you'll get more on the street and not talk about these philosophical journal articles and these philosophical arguments. But I think that whenever you look at these, especially whenever you notice that there's kind of a distinction to be made between a logical problem of evil and an evidential problem of evil, and whenever you're looking at these arguments from these philosophers, it kind of brings out a lot of issues that maybe we wouldn't talk about if we just talked about what people talk about on the street. And also, we will probably touch on a lot of issues that can be answered that you will run into on the street. So I just think it's a good way to do it. Really quickly, I've been sitting on the same slide for a while, and on my slide right now, we just made the distinction between moral evil and natural evil. There's also an important distinction you want to make between logical problems of evil and evidential problems of evil, okay? And like I said, I'm going to show you a logical problem. I'm going to show you an evidential problem here in a second. A logical problem of evil, my slide defines it's defined on my slide as the formulation of the problem of evil that attempts to show that given the existence of evil, theism is illogical. An evidential problem of evil is a little bit different. My slide lists this: the formulation of the problem of evil that attempts to show that given the amount of evil in the world, theism is unreasonable. You might be thinking that these two definitions basically say the same thing, and they kind of do because they're both problems of evil, but there's a really important difference between a logical problem of evil and an evidential problem, okay? A logical problem of evil, what sets these apart is mainly they are trying to show that monotheism, the belief that in an all-good, all-powerful, all-knowing God, is internally incoherent some way. So logical problems are problems that say that monotheism is illogical itself. It's internally incoherent because it holds contradictory beliefs. So it's wrong. Evidential problems don't try to say that theism is internally incoherent. Instead, evidential problems point at the amount of evil in the world, and they say that this amount of evil in reality is incompatible with what we think would be there if God did exist, if an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good God did exist. So therefore, monotheism, is more than likely not true. Okay? It's kind of a small distinction, but a logical problem is saying that monotheism is internally incoherent. It just contradicts itself. An evidential problem is just saying that it is likely that monotheism is false based on some evidence they're pointing to. Okay? That's why it's called an evidential problem of evil. Well, like I said, I'll be showing you different versions of these just to give you an idea of how this is done. And you don't necessarily have to be an atheist to make these arguments. Maybe you could be a pantheist or somebody else who's trying to prove monotheism to be wrong. So maybe you're a Buddhist, or Buddhism doesn't necessarily entail pantheism. But you know what I'm saying? You don't have to be an atheist. So don't think I'm just picking on atheists here. It just so happens that these arguments from evil are formulated by two atheists. But you wouldn't have to be just an atheist to make these. You could be a Hindu, a pantheist of some kind. You could be a Buddhist, you name it. But all of these arguments are against monotheism, right? Which is the basis for Christianity. So, anyways, having said that, the first argument I want to show you is on my slide. I've got it listed as J.L. Mackey's logical problem of evil. And this formulation of the problem of evil, a logical problem of evil, by the way, like my slide shows, comes from a philosopher. He's not alive anymore, but his name was J.L. Mackey. And he wrote an article that was published in 1955 called Evil and Omnipotence. If you ever studied the philosophy of religion, this is a really famous article in the debate over the problem of evil, okay? Usually shown as the example of what a logical problem of evil is, okay? So if you read his article, you'll see that how he presented it. Basically, he just emphasized, as these do, what monotheism says. And I'll read this argument like it's shown on my slide. There's 4 premises and 1 conclusion. So premise 1 says God is omnipotent, and that means God is all powerful. Number 2, God is wholly good. Number 3, evil exists. Number 4, premise 4 says a good omnipotent thing eliminates evil completely. 5, therefore, God's existence is logically incompatible with the existence of evil. This is how Mackey presented it. He thought that 1, 2, and 3, premise 1, 2, and 3 were basically what theism teaches. God is omnipotent. God is wholly good. It's not that monotheism teaches that evil exists, but when you look in the world, obviously you can see that evil does exist. And a lot of times monotheistic religions do have scriptures that do talk about evil, right? So evil existing is a part of most monotheistic systems. However, he thought that an implicit premise, maybe not something specifically stated all the time, but something that definitely he thought easily follows from 1 and 2, that God is all good and God is all powerful, is premise 4. A good omnipotent thing eliminates evil completely, right? And a lot of people would think that's pretty intuitive. If God is all good, God is going to want to eliminate evil. If God is all powerful, God has the ability to eliminate all evil. So therefore, the way this argument kind of works, and the way the person using evil as a means to argue against God's existence, the idea usually is, right, if God is all good, all powerful, then God would want to eliminate evil, and God has the ability to do so. So you wouldn't think that evil would exist at all. But since evil does exist, given premise 1 and 2, and given what follows from that a good omnipotent thing eliminates evil completely, you've got a contradiction here. So if monotheism entails 1, 2, 3, and 4, God is omnipotent, God is wholly good, evil exists, but a good omnipotent thing eliminates evil, then monotheism itself is internally incoherent because it holds contradictory beliefs. It would be like believing that it's possible to travel north south. It would be like believing that Star Wars is both the greatest and the worst movie ever made. Those things can't be true in the same way at the same time. And it just doesn't make sense to hold two contradictory beliefs like that. Well, that's what J.L. Mackie was saying is happening with monotheism. He argued that the existence of evil is something that shows that monotheism is false because it's internally incoherent. And one thing so after he presents this argument, he says, yeah, so you've got premise 1, 2, 3, and 4. Together, these make a contradiction. But the monotheist, if he or she wants to get out of the problem, then he or she is going to need to eliminate one of these premises. But what he argued was, but here's the thing, nobody is going to want to do that. You talk about premise number 1, God is omnipotent. The monotheist isn't going to want to say that God is not omnipotent, right? Because monotheism, and if you're talking specifically about Christianity, the Bible says that God created the universe. It talks about God's immense power in many places, but also, monotheists believe that God created the universe from nothing, basically, right? So it wouldn't, and this is something that Mackie mentioned in his article. He says the monotheist isn't going to want to give up premise 1, but even if the monotheist did give up premise 1 that God is omnipotent, then this really wouldn't make sense. How could God have created everything from nothing, but also not be all powerful? He just argues, you're either not going to want to give this up, or it's not going to make sense if you do give it up. You're trying to defend God's existence, and if you give up premise 1, you're basically changing the definition of what usually monotheists believe God is in the first place. Really, the same thing happens with premise 2. Nobody's going to want to give up this attribute of God being all good or all loving or however you want to say that, right? In the philosophical debate, it gets really technical, and it is important what you mean when you say God is all good, and it is important. There is a distinction between being all good and all loving, but anyways, I'm not going to go into that deep into the distinctions. But generally, monotheists don't want to give up premise 2, right? Mackie mentions that you can give up premise 3, that evil exists, and some people have tried to do this in certain ways. If you look in the history of the debate, and I don't remember if we're going to talk about this in the next lecture, but some monotheists have had something called a privation view of evil, and that's where they say that evil does exist in reality, but it's a privation of the good. So although it does exist, it's not substantial. Honestly, we don't need to talk about that. Really, the monotheist usually isn't going to want to give up number 3, because either if the monotheist gives this up, it's either just basically a blatant omission of basically what everybody can see when we go out into the world, or it's just dishonest. Evil obviously does exist in this world. There's bad things happening all the time. People do it to each other, and also we can see natural bad things that we seem to be bad to us as well, like people dying and getting sick and children getting cancer and all sorts of stuff like that. So generally, the monotheist isn't going to want to give up number 3 without being ad hoc or just without being in denial, right? So premise number 4 is where it gets tricky. Premise 4 says a good omnipotent thing eliminates evil completely. Now, in his article, Mackie doesn't necessarily explain the options for this one, and I think he just mainly he did argue that it should be a premise in his argument. It does follow from theism, so generally what he meant, and he just didn't spend time on this one like he did the others, but I think it's because he had already established that he thinks this is what follows from it. And generally, right, monotheists are going to say that, since God is all good and all powerful, he not only wants to eliminate evil, but he can. So here's the issue: if you go with all four of these, it seems like there's a contradiction, and monotheism is contradicting itself, internally incoherent, right? The beliefs that monotheism entails don't go with each other, is what Mackey was saying. So after talking about your options for eliminating all these, he mentioned usually the monotheist doesn't want to get rid of any of them. He said, well, let me, before I conclude my article, he talked about what he called fallacious solutions to to these issues. And if you can see my slides, it says evil. His list of what he called fallacious solutions to this logical problem are: evil is necessary, there's a greater good defense, a variation of the greater good defense, and a free will defense. And I'm gonna talk about all four of those and discuss it kind of the way he mentioned it. So the first one, he said he thinks it would be a fallacious solution, a problematic answer, basically, is what he's saying, to say that evil is necessary somehow. In the next lecture, you'll see answers to the problems of evil, and a lot of times they will be similar to this, but we'll mention why we think they work. So don't think that monotheism is in deep trouble or anything after this. I'm just showing how Mackey defended his argument. So, anyways, Mackey said that to say that evil is necessary, or that evil is a necessary counterpart to good, is a fallacious solution, right? He says this solution is fallacious because it limits God's power, he thinks. If the theist attempts to say that evil is somehow necessary, or that God cannot prevent it somehow, then the theist is ultimately rejecting premise one, that God is omnipotent. Mackey also said that this answer tacitly rejects premise 4, that a good omnipotent thing eliminates evil completely. Because if evil is somehow necessary, then this would rule out that God would eliminate evil as far as he could. It seems the only way to fix this problem would be to alter what holy good means, and this is kind of like rejecting premise 2. So Mackey didn't think it made sense, or he thought it was a bad solution, a solution that didn't work, to try to say that evil is necessary somehow. If you are familiar with the debate over the problem of evil, there's also something called a greater good defense, and that's a lot of times where the monotheist will say, well, God allows evil to bring about some greater good. Well, Mackey didn't think that the greater good defense works either. And he mentioned it kind of like evil is necessary as a means to the good. And that's, basically what I just said. It's when the monotheist will try to argue that, well, God is going to allow evil as the means to reach some higher good that wouldn't come about if evil wasn't already there, right? And, well, Mackey says that this statement that evil is necessary as a means to some good seems to bind God in what he could do. Mackey thought it was like some kind of causal law that wouldn't make sense given God's omnipotence unless God were to bind himself in some way. Does that make sense? Mackey said there shouldn't be a causal law like this if God is all-powerful, so this solution is either a rejection of premise 2, that God is all good, or the term omnipotence needs altering. So, does that make sense? Mackey thinks that it doesn't work to say that God needs to use evil as a means to some higher good, because this seems to be like God. If God is all-powerful, then God shouldn't have to use evil to bring about a higher good, is what Mackey is saying. If God is all-powerful, it would only make sense to say that he has to use evil as a means to some higher good, only if he bound his own limitless power. So that's why Mackey doesn't think that works. Now, Mackey did say maybe you could take a variation of this. There's a variation on the greater good defense. And he kind of mentioned it as the universe is better with some evil in it than it could be if there were no evil. Some people have tried to argue that in this debate. Right? And when you think about it, I'll mention that here in a second. But Mackey mentions that some philosophers are trying to say that evil makes the world a better place, which of course might sound crazy if you're new to this debate, but it is actually a very simple concept. So, for example, without danger there can be no bravery. Without pain and disease, for example, there can be no sympathy or benevolence or helping people out, empathy and all that. Without ugliness, we cannot truly appreciate beauty. These are some things that monotheists have argued for. Well, Mackey says that this might work for what he calls first-order evils like pain, disease, and misery. So according to this variation on the greater good defense, these first-order evils are logically necessary for second-order goods, such as sympathy, bravery, benevolence, like I just mentioned, right? God allows pain, God allows disease and misery to bring about second-order goods like sympathy, bravery, benevolence. However, Mackey says that there also seems to be second-order evils. Your first-order evils are those things, like mainly natural evils, that if these didn't exist, then you couldn't have these second-order goods. But Mackey says there seem to be second-order evils, like malevolence, cruelty, callousness, and cowardice, that do not seem to be logically necessary for some higher-order good, is how he argued. So while this solution seems to eliminate the problem with first-order evils, it leaves the problem of second-order evils and is either a rejection of premise 4 or a rejection of premise 2. Premise 4 being a good omnipotent thing eliminates completely evil completely, or premise 2, God is wholly good. So really, either way, Mackey is saying that if you're using the greater good defense, he thinks you're rejecting premise 2, that God is wholly good. So that's why he thinks those solutions don't work. Now, the last one to mention, the last one that he talked about was the free will defense. And this definitely is something that you should know about if you are familiar with the debate in Western philosophy over the problem of evil, especially the contemporary debate. There's something called the free will defense. And a lot of times the monotheists will say that God allows evil because God wants human beings to have free will, right? A lot of times it has to do with why they think God created the universe, but they'll say God wanted human beings to have free will, and if human beings are truly going to have free will and be able to make whatever decisions they want, then God necessarily needs to allow evil, right? Because if he created human beings and forced them to do what he wanted them to do, they wouldn't have free will. So allowing evil is something that is necessary if you also want to allow human beings to make their own choices. Yeah, and that's kind of how Mackey explains it, as evil is due to human free will. Now, Mackey thought this solution, like the others, it was wrong. Now, but he mentions that this solution does seem to fix the problem to an extent. So first-order evils, the lower kinds, can be explained with their logical necessity in deriving second-order goods. So, for example, free will is said to be a third-order good that explains all of the second-order evils. I know I'm throwing out a lot of things there, but if you remember, what we're saying is, with what's entailed with this free will defense, is that you've got first-order evils are things like pain, disease, misery. Second-order goods come from first-order evils like sympathy, bravery, benevolence. Mackey is saying it's possible that the free will defense is, because if you remember, Mackey was saying the greater good defense doesn't necessarily, it leaves open this issue of second-order evils, things that are worse than the first-order evils. And these second-order evils are things like malevolence, cruelty, callousness, cowardice. Well, Mackey is saying that the free will defense seems to maybe answer all of this, provide an answer for even the second-order evils. So basically, the free will defense is saying that it is better for human beings to have free will, which makes malevolence, cowardice, etc. possible, than for them to be mindless automatons incapable of second-order evils. However, Mackey's issue with this, because he thinks the free will defense is ultimately fallacious, Mackey objects to this solution as well because he thinks there is nothing contradictory in the notion, in the idea that an omnipotent God could create a world in which free-willed creatures always freely choose the good and refrain from evil. This is another case in which a holy good God should be doing something to prevent evils, but is obviously not doing so. Therefore, again, God must not either be omnipotent or wholly good. Does that make sense? Mackey is saying that if you truly think that God is all-powerful, then there doesn't seem to be necessarily a contradiction in believing that God could create a world where everybody freely chooses the good. God's not forcing them to do it, but because God is all powerful, he can create a universe where all free will beings just choose the good. So he thinks that if you use this free will defense, you're basically either denying premise 1 or 2, that for some reason, it ultimately leads to like the evil is necessary or the problems with the greater good defense. You're answering second order evils, but you're doing it in a way that limits God's power or seems to be a self-limiting of God's power and doesn't really make any sense. So there you have it. This is J.L. Mackey's logical problem of evil. And what he's saying is, He's looking at theism, monotheism from the outside, and he's just emphasizing everything it seems to teach, and he's arguing that ultimately it contradicts itself, and it's internally incoherent. Okay? That's a logical problem of evil, and that's the way J.L. Mackey argued for it. Now, next I wanted to walk you through a evidential problem of evil. Okay? The one I was going to show is another famous one in the contemporary debate on the problem of evil. You definitely learn about it if you took a course on it in a philosophy course in a university or a seminary today. So this one comes from William Rowe, and he published this in an article titled "The Problem of Evil and Some Varieties of Atheism." He published this in 1979, and William Rowe has been a big name in this debate. I have always found this article, "The Problem of Evil and Some Varieties of Atheism," really refreshing, by the way. William Rowe argued for what he called friendly atheism, and it was basically, I'll get into it here whenever I show you this argument, but it's basically this idea that he said, I can see that it's reasonable that monotheists believe that God exists. But he said, whenever I show you this evidential argument that I have, this is my way of showing you that I think it's reasonable to be an atheist, is what he said. So he's saying that we can kind of come together and see that both of us have reasons for believing what we do. And maybe there's not a knockdown argument for either way, but at least I have reasons for believing what I do. So he's not very militaristic or crass or in your face and demeaning like some atheists have been, like Charles Dawkins or somebody like that. But anyways, let me show you this argument. So, like we said, this is an evidential problem, and what it's going to try to do, it's not going to try to say that theism is internally incoherent. It's just going to say that the amount of suffering in the world is evidence that theism is more than likely false. Okay, so these premises are kind of long, but there's just two premises and a conclusion. But if you'll bear with me, I'm going to read these. Premise 1 says, there exist instances of intense suffering which an omnipotent, omniscient being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. Premise 2, an omniscient, holy, good being would prevent the occurrence of any intense suffering it could, unless it could not do so without hereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. The conclusion is, therefore, there does not exist an omnipotent, omniscient, holy, good being. Okay? And let me just explain these premises really quickly. Again, premise 1 says, there exist instances of intense suffering which an omnipotent, omniscient being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. What Rowe here is saying is that when you look out in the world, that's just a long way of talking about something that eventually became known as gratuitous suffering. Rowe thinks, and this all comes out in premise 2. Maybe I should have just jumped to that first. Premise 2 says, an omniscient, holy, good being would prevent the occurrence of any intense suffering it could, unless it could not do so without hereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. Does that make sense? Premise 2 is basically a statement of both monotheism and the greater good defense. Rowe is saying that if you had some being that was all-powerful and all good, it wouldn't allow evil to occur unless this was to bring about some greater good, or to at least allow, or at least to bring about an equal good, right? Or God would only allow evil to occur if it was to eliminate some other evil that was equally bad or worse than the evil that he's allowing. So does that make sense? It's kind of like a statement of a greater good defense, where God only allows evil to bring about a higher good or to eliminate a worse evil, basically. Okay? Now, premise one, though, is saying that there seem to be types of evil in our world that don't bring about some greater good. There seem to be occurrences of evil that don't bring about a greater good, or don't seem to be there to eliminate some worse evil. So Rowe concludes that therefore there is no being like we mentioned in premise 2. There is no omniscient, holy, good being, because we see this type of evil in the world. And not only do we see it, but we see it in great abundance. Mackey in this article is famous for talking about this example of a fawn in a deer being trapped in a forest fire, right? And he says, well, imagine that there's some fawn, some deer gets trapped, is walking along, minding its own business in the forest, but there's a forest fire for some reason, not due to human beings, maybe just natural causes, and the forest is on fire, and the fawn is running through the forest trying to get away from it, but a tree falls over onto the fawn. Now, the fawn doesn't die, though. The fawn doesn't die. It's just pinned down by the tree. But in the course of the forest fire, the fawn is trapped, and the fawn gets badly burned all over its body. So it doesn't die right away after it gets trapped and burned, but it suffers over the course of 3 or 4 days. Eventually it does die. Mackey is saying that an example like this seems to be an instance of intense suffering that God wouldn't allow, because I hope I didn't say Mackey. Rowe's issue is that if this happened to the fawn, what good could possibly come from that fawn suffering for 3 or 4 days? Does that make sense? Like, yes, a fawn, animals dying in the woods happens all the time, and oftentimes their bodies either get eaten by some other animal, or their bodies just decay and become fertilizer, basically, right? And it actually helps the ecosystem as a whole. But that's not the issue. It's not necessarily the fawn dying that's the issue. It's the suffering of the fawn before it died. Mackey's issue is that what greater good could possibly come from that? What greater evil is being prevented if the fawn suffers for 3 or 4 days? And Mackey is arguing that this is what we would call gratuitous suffering that shouldn't be allowed to occur if God is all-knowing and all-powerful, because there doesn't seem, like we said, to be some greater good that's coming out of it, or some equal or worse evil that's being prevented. And now, having said all this, Mackey isn't saying that he has proof that something like this has happened before. What he mentions is that he doesn't know. For one, how are we supposed to know if for sure there was no purpose to it? But also, he doesn't have a camera that shows a fawn suffering in the woods for 3 days. But he says, but when you look at the natural history of the earth, it's easy to conclude that something like this has happened, because animals die all the time. There's evidence in the fossil record and what we see today that animals get cancer, animals eat each other. I mean, there's all sorts of, nature red in tooth and claw and all that. A lot of seemingly horrible things happen to animals on a daily basis in this world. And Mackey's arguing that it would be easy to conclude that something like what happened to the fawn has happened many, many, many times over in the natural history of the earth. So Rowe is arguing that all of this builds up to a huge mountain of evidence against the existence of God. So given that there seems to be a large amount of gratuitous suffering in the world, it is likely that God does not exist, okay? Now, Rowe goes on to mention, as a monotheist, how would you answer this problem? He says that Well, it's in regard to both premise 1 and 2. Rowe says that since premise 2 will likely be accepted by most theists, if you're going to directly reject any one of these premises, it's most likely going to be 2. Rowe mentions a couple solutions similar to the ones that Mackey mentioned when Mackey was talking about his logical problems. And Rowe says that there is a direct and an indirect way to reject premise 1. So a direct rejection of premise 1 might involve the concept that God allows evils for greater goods such as spiritual development, something known as soul making, if you've ever heard the term. Maybe God allows evils in this world for spiritual development reasons. Another direct solution of rejecting premise 1 that Rowe mentions is that maybe some suffering results from human free will and could only be prevented by limited human freedom. And in fact, some monotheists I've read have actually done things like this. And even with the example of the fawn burning in the woods, I've heard monotheists argue that, well, yeah, there doesn't seem to be any reason why the fawn would suffer for 3 days before it died. But monotheists will argue, well, don't forget that monotheism also entails that there's angels and demons, and maybe the suffering of the fawn was caused by demons, the free will choices of demons. So, whether you talk about a couple of those, Mackey says, yeah, you could probably directly reject premise 1 by mentioning some of these. Maybe God allows all this natural evil to occur, and obviously also allows moral evil to occur. What seemingly looks like horrible, horrendous, gratuitous suffering might be there for soul-making reasons. So as we view this world full of what looks like gratuitous suffering, even though it might not be bringing about some greater good or preventing some evil just as bad, the soul-making that comes from it, the maturing process, the spiritual maturing process that human beings get from viewing all this and experiencing all this evil is, in another way, a greater good that's being brought out. Or maybe it's all occurring because of free will choices of human beings and maybe even angels and demons. Now, having said that, another interesting, because, Mackey doesn't think that really anybody's going to reject premise 2 in this argument. He thinks most people think that if God would allow evil, it would need to be for a good reason. So that's why he said mainly the rejection of this argument from the monotheists is going to come from rejecting premise 1. Now, an interesting thing that Rowe does is that he talks about a way that monotheists, and this is Rowe really explaining why he thinks it's reasonable to be both either a monotheist or an atheist. Obviously, he himself argued that atheism is more than likely true to him. But he said, just like how, similar to how the problem of evil is formulated in the first place, a good omnipotent thing would eliminate evil unless it had a good reason, but there is a bunch of evil that looks like a good omnipotent thing wouldn't allow, therefore God doesn't exist. Rowe mentions that as a monotheist, you could kind of flip the argument on its head and use the idea of what monotheism teaches to kind of show that there shouldn't be a problem in the first place. He called this an indirect solution to his evidential problem. And Rowe formulated it like this, and you actually end up just kind of flipping some of the things that his argument said. So this would be an indirect solution to the evidential problem, and he formulated it as a new argument coming from his hypothetical theist. So premise 1 in this new indirect solution to the problem says, there exists an omnipotent, omniscient, holy, good being. Premise 2 says an omniscient, holy being would prevent the occurrence of any intense suffering it could, unless it could not do so without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. The conclusion, therefore, it is not the case that there exist instances of intense suffering which an omnipotent, omniscient being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. Does that make sense? What Rowe is saying is that to indirectly answer his evidential problem, you could basically say, well, when we look at these situations like with the fawn getting burned in the woods, we can't see, we look at it and we go, well, it doesn't seem like we can see for ourselves or know if this suffering really does have some higher purpose, or if it really is preventing some evil that's equally as bad or worse. But he says, if a monotheist could say, though, because the monotheist has reasons to believe that there does exist an omnipotent, omniscient, holy, good being, and because they think that an omniscient, holy, good being would eliminate evil without a good reason, that means, therefore, that even though we can't be certain, we just need to conclude that there is no such thing as gratuitous evil. So, anyways, that was I hope I haven't been saying Mackey. That was Rowe's ways of saying how you could kind of answer his. And of course, at the end of the day, in his article, he concluded that yes, he thought that atheism is a better position to hold. He thought when you look at all the evil in the world, it seems to provide evidence that monotheism likely is not true. Okay? So I hope I haven't shook you up if you are new to this debate, but just know that there's going to be a lot of answers coming, okay? And like I said, in the next lecture, we're going to talk about solutions to the problem of evil. I'm going to make a distinction between what people say, and because there's different labels for different types of solutions. But usually when you're talking about an answer to the problem of evil from a monotheistic standpoint, the answer will be called a theodicy. And if you can see my slide, it says it lists theodicy, and it's defined as the attempt to justify God's permitting evil to occur in the world. Okay, so a theodicy basically is a monotheist trying to give reasons for why we think that God does allow evil. And a lot of things that I've mentioned do provide theodicies, are examples of theodicies. But there's a couple that we haven't mentioned, and this is what I'm going to be getting into in the next lecture. So there is something called the greater good defense. There is something called the free will defense. There's also something I didn't mention called the natural order defense, and there's something else called skeptical theism, which I've always enjoyed. I thought was kind of a funny label for it. But we're going to talk about these: greater good defense, free will defense, natural order defense, skeptical theism in the next lecture. And I'm going to be explaining to you all these monotheistic answers to the problem of evil, and why we think these do answer both logical and evidential arguments, okay? But that's a lot for another lecture, right? What I wanted to finish this lecture out doing is talking about what we would call the problem of good. But just because someone thinks that evil disproves God's existence doesn't mean that all the burden is on the monotheist to show that this isn't a problem for monotheism. I wanted to point this out because sometimes people forget about this. And this is what I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture. The thing is, there's something that, and this actually could be called the problem of evil as well. It's just that whenever someone mentions the problem of evil, usually the first thing that will come to your mind is that this is an issue for monotheism. But what monotheists have brought up is something called the problem of good. The problem of good is something that monotheists say is an issue for atheism. If you remember going all the way back to those lectures where we talked about the moral argument for God's existence, what we argued was that if morality is objective, then God must exist, because morality can't be objective if God does not exist, right? Whether you're talking about moral values and duties, whether it's moral values or moral duties, it doesn't matter. If you believe that morality is objective, then you must also believe that God exists. Well, maybe you've realized this, maybe you haven't. But what the monotheist is arguing is that the atheist, in formulating problems of evil against God's existence, is using a concept that could only exist, could only actually be grounded and be a thing, can only be objective, let's say, if God exists. Does that make sense? Now, I do want to stop and make a distinction, though. If you're talking about a logical problem of evil, someone that's saying that monotheism is internally incoherent, then the problem of good isn't going to apply to that, because The atheist or whoever is just examining monotheism and saying that this system seems to be internally incoherent. So if someone's making a logical problem, then you can't really use the problem of good to answer them back. But if someone is making an evidential problem and saying, look, I think whenever I look out in the world, I see all this evil, and that's obviously bad, it seems to serve as evidence that theism is more than likely false. This is where you emphasize the problem of good and say, maybe even present the moral argument for God's existence and say, well, here's the thing. Here's a problem with saying that the existence of evil disproves God's existence. The problem is that if evil truly does exist, objective, because when you talk about something being bad, right? When you say that people ought not to die, or there ought not to be hurricanes or tornadoes or disease, there ought not to be pain, you're saying how the world ought to be, and this is a moral value that you have. You're saying the world ought to be this way rather than another. If you're arguing that objectively and saying that's just how reality should be, there shouldn't be death, there shouldn't be suffering. If you're saying that morality is objective, the problem is that can only be objective if God exists. So it can't possibly disprove God's existence, because God would need to exist for the concept of evil to be objective in the first place. If they don't think that morality is objective, if moral values and duties are objective, then basically they would be presenting an argument against God's existence using some subjective statement like, people shouldn't die. Well, if I say people shouldn't die or disease is bad, and I mean that subjectively, like morality is relative to the individual, then I'm just giving my opinion and my preference. But how could my opinion or my preference objectively disprove the existence of God? It can't. You can't say, well, I don't like the taste of this food, so therefore God doesn't exist. That's silly, right? People need to use objective evidence to prove that God objectively doesn't exist if that's what they want to do. You can't use subjective evidence, some opinion that you hold, to conclude that God objectively doesn't exist in reality, right? And that's what's happening here. If someone is making an evidential problem, you say, well, why do you believe in objective good and evil in the first place? Because if you believe in those things, you must also believe in God. Well, if they say, okay, well, never mind then, I think it's all relative. When you say, well, then now that you're trying to prove that God doesn't exist using your opinion. So either way, it's problematic for you. Okay, so that's something to remember. The problem of evil isn't just a problem for theism. It's also a problem for atheism, because good and evil can't even exist unless God exists. So I jumped ahead of my slides, but I've got the problem of good defined as the emphasis by theists that atheism has no grounds to make moral judgments and therefore has no positive argument for atheism regarding good and evil. So there's the 2 points I made. The atheist says the existence of evil is evidence against theism, but the existence of evil is only possible if God exists. So just something to be thinking about. It's really, maybe not too many people realize it, because you get caught up just wanting to defend monotheism, but you need to remind them that if they're using the evidential problem, then either God exists or they're just trying to use subjective reasons for disproving God's existence, which doesn't work, because that's just their opinion. Another thing I wanted to mention has to do with something that's called the God hypothesis. My slide here, I have the God hypothesis listed as a term used by scientifically minded people who emphasize that the claim that God exists is scientifically testable. If you've ever heard of Victor Stenger or Richard Dawkins, okay? Oh, I think I called him Charles Dawkins earlier. I don't know why, but I often have a problem. Oftentimes have a problem remembering his name for some reason. But Victor Stenger, Richard Dawkins, okay? Stenger wrote a book called God, the Failed Hypothesis. Dawkins wrote a book called The God Delusion. In both of these works, these men talk about God's existence. They call it the God hypothesis. The thing is, they're really scientifically minded people, and a lot of times really scientifically minded people think that most things are scientific questions. I would argue that God's existence is not a scientific question. It's a philosophical question. But anyways, you can kind of humor someone a little bit to an extent. So like when you're talking about the problem of evil, if someone says, well, oh, so you're talking about the God hypothesis. Well, let's look at what we see in reality and test that up against the theory that an all good God exists. That's basically like I've got that definition for God hypothesis right there, saying it's the idea that the claim that God exists is scientifically testable. Okay. Oftentimes what happens is, and this especially comes out in the debate over the problem of evil, the atheist will say, okay, well, let's imagine that there is an all good, all powerful, all good God. As a hypothesis, we're going to want to make predictions from that hypothesis, and we're going to want to test these predictions against what we see in reality. And what they'll say is, well, okay, so let's pretend, let's imagine that an all good, all powerful God exists. What kind of world, what kind of evidence should we see to confirm that hypothesis? And they'll argue that if an all good, all knowing, all powerful God existed, then you shouldn't see evil. But we do see evil in the world. Therefore, it's a failed hypothesis. It's an incorrect hypothesis. Oftentimes, what they'll say is when you look at the suffering in the world that animals experience and that humans experience, they'll argue that this is exactly what you should expect to see if you think the world is ran by and explainable only in terms of the blind, random, natural processes, right? The indifferent laws, physical laws of nature are the biggest game in town. Therefore, really, the existence of humanity, the existence of life, and everything on the earth is just a product of these blind, random, natural processes, right? So they say when you have a world like that, you just expect to see suffering because suffering kind of plays a role in helping things survive. But if thinking of the God hypothesis, if there's an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good God, then you wouldn't expect to see this stuff, okay? And that might sound like a good argument on the surface, but I did want to mention something here. And we're going to be going over answers to the problem of evil, so this isn't necessarily providing a theodicy right now, but similar to the problem of good, I do want to point out an issue with this idea that the God hypothesis fails and the world we see is exactly what you would expect if it was ran by blind, random, natural laws. The issue is that naturalism, this idea that there is no creator, there is no intelligence or all-powerful being behind the existence of the universe, naturalism, okay, is saying that basically, naturalists will say, well, yeah, we explain everything that we see in terms of these natural physical laws. But here's the problem, though. According to naturalism, there is no creator of the universe, right? Maybe everything just came into being for no reason, if it began at all, or maybe the universe is eternal. But the universe doesn't exist for some reason, and it wasn't created by some being. So if that's the case, then the universe has no purpose, right? Everything is meaningless ultimately. We're here for no reason, and eventually, maybe the universe is just going to reach universal heat death, and all of this will have been for naught. But the biggest point is that it's all blind, random, and natural, right? And what I wanted to point out is that the problem with this is that it doesn't make any predictions as to what kind of universe you're going to find. If there is no purpose to it, if it's all blind, random, then any universe that you see would be a universe predicted by naturalism. Does that make sense? Naturalism doesn't really predict any specific universe. It's the best a naturalist can do is look at it like a inference to the best explanation, because I've seen scholars in science admit this. Naturalism doesn't predict what kind of universe you're going to see. Because it's blind, because it's random, natural processes, it doesn't predict what you're going to see. So what we see isn't exactly what we expect on naturalism. What we see is compatible with naturalism, but not predicted by naturalism. Does that make sense? So you want to press that point. And in fact, you want to talk about in terms of explanatory power and in terms of predictions that theism would make. Here's the thing is that, monotheists have pointed this out. And I think I'm going to mention this more 2 lectures from now when we talk about the Bible and evil. But monotheists have asked themselves, if God is infinitely perfect, why would God want to create anything in the first place? Well, they think that because God is infinite love, because God is infinitely loving, God doesn't want to be selfish and just keep this infinite perfection to himself. They think, like God's not like, if God is infinitely perfect, God doesn't want for anything. So it was actually more of an issue for theism. They were worried that maybe theism was internally incoherent because it wouldn't even make sense that God would want to make anything if God is infinitely powerful. If God is infinitely perfect and powerful and knowledgeable, then there's nothing that God could or would make or even, to fulfill any need. God doesn't want for anything, so why would God create something? Well, they thought the solution was that since God is all loving, God would want to share that love with other free will creatures, right? You have to, if you're going to share your love, you're going to need to share love with other persons, and they have to have free will, because you can't share love between someone that you're forcing to share that love with you, right? You have to create rational beings, persons who can know and can choose to love you back. So actually, monotheism predicts that any universe that exists, since monotheists believe that God exists, they say that this actually brings about a prediction, and it says that any universe that will exist will contain rational beings in it that can know and love God. So, because does that make sense when you look at, maybe in regards to the question of why does evil exist, maybe that tips the scales to naturalism a little bit more, because you would assume that all good God would eliminate evil. But you want to talk about the very existence of rational beings to ask this question in the first place, the fact that we have self-aware, rational human beings in this universe, the fact that we even have life in this universe. Those 2 things are cosmic accidents that naturalism, for one, doesn't predict. And naturalism also entails that these are highly improbable in any given universe that exists. But monotheism, if you want to talk about it as a hypothesis, would predict that any universe that exists is going to include rational, not only life, but rational life. So I would say that if you want to look at it like a hypothesis, then monotheism wins out. Maybe evil is in tips the scales for naturalism, but when you want to talk about why does life exist in the first place, I think it highly favors the God hypothesis. So anyways, I feel like I've been running a little long, but those are some things I wanted to mention. One point that I really loved, and again, we're going to get to all the theodicies, try to mention all the major answers to the problem of evil here in the next lecture. But a point that I saw in a book called Stealing from God, Why Atheists Need God to Make Their Case by Frank Turek, he has this chart that he lists, and he says, look, the problem of evil might seem really, really big, but when you think about it, and especially listeners of this podcast and viewers of this these videos, if you've followed all the things that we've looked at so far, there's a ton of evidence for God. And really, the problem of evil is the main thing that people use to try to say that God doesn't exist. Anyways, Frank Turek has this chart in his book, and the title, at the top it says, "Does God exist?" And it basically lists all the evidence for yes and all the evidence for no. In the yes column, it's got like over 10 things. It says the beginning of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, consistent laws of nature, reason and the laws of logic and mathematics, information and intentionality, like information like the genetic code and intentionality, life, mind and consciousness, free will, objective morality, beauty and pleasure, Old Testament prophecy, and the life and resurrection of Jesus. All of this is evidence for God's existence. And then in the no column, he just has one there listed. It says evil. So whenever you think about it, there's evil is a tough issue, and it is something we have to talk about for a lot. But when you think about all the evidence for monotheism, especially the evidence for Christianity, It's really, there's a ton of evidence for God and not so much evidence against God. So I just love that point that he made in that book. Well, that's all I had for this lecture, and we're going to close it out with our quote and our questions for reflection. And then, like I said, in the next lecture, we are going to be talking about theodicies, all the answers to the problem of evil. So here's our quote. It's from Frank Turek in that book I mentioned, Stealing from God. He says, "Good reason provides all the information we need to see that the very existence of evil is a contradiction for atheism. If evil is real, then atheism is false." And again, here's our questions for reflection that we gave you at the beginning. Our first question was, have you ever thought of why there is evil in the world if God is supposed to be all-powerful and all-good? Second question was, how have you dealt with this thought? And the third is the existence of evil just a problem for theism? Those were our questions for reflection. Really quick, like I do at the end of all these, I wanted to make a shout out to Southern Evangelical Seminary and Bible College. I gave most of the information in this series in a class at Kingdom Preparatory Academy to juniors and seniors. But you can go way beyond all this information and go even deeper in all these topics that I've covered in this class. And one great way to do that is to go to SES, go to Southern Evangelical Seminary and Bible College. They have in-person courses there in Matthews, North Carolina. They have online courses you can get from anywhere in the world, and you can get certificates, bachelor's degree, master degree, master of divinity, Master of Theology, Doctor of Ministry, PhD. It's as little or as much as you want to do, but you can get in depth in all of this. You can study philosophy, apologetics, theology, study the biblical languages, all that stuff. If you want to go deeper, I suggest you go to Southern Evangelical Seminary. That's where I went, and I highly recommend it. It was a great place. Also, if you are looking for a classical Christian alternative to education for your kids in the Lubbock, Texas area, I recommend Kingdom Preparatory Academy. This is where, like I said, where I taught a class on Christian apologetics to juniors and seniors. It's a great school. My kids go there. We love it. It's a little bit different. It's a university model. So right now, my third and first grader only go to school on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Tuesday and Thursday, they're home doing homework at home. So by the time they get to college, they're going to be very independent and already be in that rhythm of only going to school parts of the week, and for the rest of the week, they're working on their work by themselves and helping themselves out. It's a classical school, so they're taught how to think, not what to think. We love it. It's obviously also grounded in the Bible and a biblical worldview. So a really great place. I recommend you check them out. It's kingdomprep.org if you're looking for more information, or you can just Google it. You can give them a call, send them an email. We'd love to see you there, and definitely pay it a visit if you're interested. But that's it for this lecture. And like I said, in the next one, we're going to be talking about answers to the problem of evil. And I hope to see you there, and I hope you have a great day.